I'm very excited to be here, largely because when I was listening to the ambassador and many of her thoughts, as well as looking at who's here in attendance, it is clear indication that we are at a crossroads when it comes to our infrastructure asset management and beginning to rethink how we incorporate climate risk and adaptation into our processes. So what I hope to do here today is just to walk you through a brief presentation, in which case it's otherwise premised on us resetting infrastructure asset management as municipalities in Ontario. So with that, I hope to spark some interest, possibly some discussion amongst the participants here today, to otherwise get us to think about how do we move forward, as well as getting us excited for what we have ahead of us in this fantastic conference, both part one, but also part two and part three to come with us. So with that, I want to just start us off with the perception that infrastructure asset management is at a crossroads. And as municipalities, we are all well aware that we are overwhelmingly the stewards for Ontario's infrastructure assets. In fact, we can look at some of the statistics in which case municipalities disproportionately own, for example, the roadway systems we have here in Ontario, accounting for just under 70%. At the same time, our understanding about how we apply asset management principles has been growing. And this has been something that over the course of the past decade, our appreciation of these principles, but also how to put them into action, whether due to legislative requirements, but also recognizing that it makes good financial sense for our municipalities, have been migrating to a point whereby we're now having to turn our attention to what comes next. And what comes next in many ways can seem quite daunting. Just thinking about the current global pandemic that we find ourselves in, there are growing demands upon our municipal infrastructure that needs to be addressed, but increasingly with limited resources, thus putting in place the very difficult prioritization that comes into play. More specifically, the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged the public sector and also revealed quite a lot of gaps in what resiliency ultimately means and how do we address those service requirements. This is partly due to the allocation of scarce resources, but at the same time, the pandemic hasn't necessarily caused some of the underlying concerns, but rather have made them more apparent, such as issues such as inequality and vulnerabilities within our infrastructure networks. And for that reason, we are now more aware of how complex these challenges truly are. And with that, climate risk is one of the biggest, turning points that comes to when we think about the complexity of these challenges, especially on municipal infrastructure. And as we look forward, much of our discussions related to how do we move out of the pandemic and take our municipal infrastructure forward, we're often couching that with the recognition of a green recovery and building a more inclusive society in the process. So what does that mean for infrastructure asset management? Well, that has meant that there's a variety of different factors that are pushing us to take greater appreciation of climate risk, adaptation, and mitigation. For purposes of where we are in this conference, let's focus more specifically on climate risk and adaptation. And I would encourage you to stop and think about how often have you heard the term sustainability, resilience, and green infrastructure in the past 18 months vis-a-vis the past decade? I'm fairly certain that you've come across it more and more in your daily conversations. And that is increasingly tied to when we talk about infrastructure. And as the ambassador had mentioned in her speech, there are increasingly amounts of funding grants and financing sources that are integrally connected to appreciating both climate risk and adaptation. And I did notice that some of the questions that have come forward from the participants really relate to this idea of what about private sector funding and what capital markets are thinking about. And with that, they're increasingly couching that with this recognition of ESG objectives.
Virtue continue barbecue residue.
I'm sure you can hear, hopefully you can hear me okay.
Mala, could you kindly mute that, please? Sorry, Sherena.
It's okay. I was just wondering whether you could hear me. Not a problem. We're in a virtual world and things are quite challenging in many regards. So other factors that are pushing us to consider climate risk and adaptation. So in many ways, there has been some immediate reactions to some, say, extreme weather events that are causing us to rethink how we address immediate concerns. But with that, we have to also take into account the longer term life cycle of an asset and how, in fact, can greater appreciation of climate risk change how we manage our assets over the long term, as well as set aside budgets to do so. And when we turn our attention to what's happening right now, I'm sure you're all aware of what's happening in the state of Texas and as it relates to their energy systems, as well as some of their municipal water infrastructure. And that is just a key example whereby climate risks that were identified, but possibly not determined to be all that significant, did in fact materialize. And in the aftermath, it's very likely that there are going to be a lot of immediate reactions to how, say, their energy network better takes into account climate risk. But ultimately, as asset managers, our concern is not only how do we deal with the immediate aftermath, but how then we take into account the overall management of that assets from a strategic program and project level. So for that reason, a lot of these asset replacement decisions, for example, are being undertaken with an environmental lens. A good example would be when we think about some of our public transit renewal investments, whereby considerations for low carbon solutions are now being put to the forefront, in which case understanding some of the broader life cycle management considerations also need to be embedded with that. So with that, we're seeing in parallel the growth of sustainability roles within our organizations. We're also seeing the growth of specific climate adaptation and resiliency funds emerging as a way to help bridge in this transition towards a better incorporation of climate risk. And finally, a lot of asset management roles, plans, and strategies continue to emerge, recognizing that this is something that municipalities have to take into account. But one of the key challenges that is otherwise going to emerge is that these two trends are occurring in parallel. One of the key objectives of this conference is to understand how then we can link the two trends in a way to ensure that our assets have a better incorporation of climate risk and an adaptation lens. So with that, this means we're going to have to take into account this momentum and use it as an opportunity to reset what our infrastructure asset management principles, frameworks, and tools ultimately mean to better encourage resiliency. And in the process, I hope that you have an opportunity to broaden what we mean by infrastructure asset management and the different tools that are available to us to better take into account. Over the course of today and the next few sessions, you will be exposed to how we can rethink our frameworks to better take into account new perspectives, but allow for a more meaningful implementation of our infrastructure asset management principles to better address climate risk, adaptation, and to some extent, some mitigation concerns. So what does asset management currently mean within your organization? And what can that then mean afterwards when we take into account a broader perception of climate risk and adaptation? So this is a bit of a loaded question. And initially, I was contemplating giving you some polling questions, but then again, at some point over the past year, you may have been inundated with polling questions via Zoom. And as an educator, I figured maybe it's probably best for us to think about it more broadly and address some of your questions in the discussion afterwards. But by and large, When it comes to rethinking our infrastructure asset management, we tend to look at it from three different perspectives in terms of frameworks that our organizations adapt, tools that are available, and then perspectives that help guide and shape our activities, not only at a project level, but moving upwards to a program level and strategically as an organization. And finding that right balance is one in which we see a lot of variation across municipalities, whether urban or rural, larger or smaller, or even across Canada and abroad. And much of my research around the world, including here in Canada, has found that infrastructure asset management is a set of tools and techniques and frameworks that by and large offer different organizations an opportunity to take a long-term perspective when it comes to being stewards of those assets. What it means to have a longer-term perspective can vary depending on an organization's objectives. However, we are now at a point where collectively, a lot of those objectives need to include the recognition that climate risk is real. It's no longer something that's going to be considered well into the future, but rather the likelihood of an extreme weather event, or even the recognition that there could be some vulnerabilities within our infrastructure assets that can then compromise certain groups as well as levels of services is now a perspective that can no longer be ignored or considered too far remote to now include in our day-to-day planning and activities. So what does this ultimately mean? Well, our reset when it comes to infrastructure asset management is much more than just revising our frameworks. This is an opportunity to look at how far we've come and the strengths and the foundation that we have as infrastructure asset managers, as well as addressing some of the existing challenges that we've had within asset management. And in doing so, we will be better suited to then address this next frontier of better incorporating climate risk and adaptation. And on this slide, I just have a few of the common pain points that many of you may have experienced as asset managers within municipalities. And some of those challenges range from trying to build consensus on what objectives ultimately mean for our infrastructure assets and how we then approach our strategic and tactile management of them. And that can range from trying to deal with a variety of different stakeholders, how to revisit our decision-making processes, as well as dealing with the consideration that in many ways our organizations are designed that in a way that doesn't necessarily encourage collaboration across different municipal departments and entities in order to then facilitate some key infrastructure asset management decisions. When we add the prospect of resiliency planning and climate risk adaptation, then we're going to realize that that challenge has to be addressed all the more quickly, because we're going to have to, in parallel and in synergy, deal with different perspectives to achieve a broader objective. And something that also needs to be reemphasized is taking an honest look on how we otherwise better measure and take into account our data sources and develop those strategies in a way that allow us to then measure performance and then take us forward to address service standards. And finally, there's this need to embrace institutional memory and how do we collectively as an organization improve our processes. And this is where I'm quite optimistic when it comes to this conference, as well as organizations like AMONTario, as being an opportunity for us to collectively, as an industry, come together and address some of those existing challenges, but now with the opportunity to take this forward with a broader climate risk and sustainability lens. So what does this look like in practice, and how do we move forward? On this slide, I just have a few examples, and I'm happy to go into some details should there be any questions. But by and large, for us to then take this resetting exercise and move it into practice, we're going to need to take an honest look at how we otherwise engage in our practices, and then recognize that business as usual is not a viable alternative. we're going to need to rethink how we're going to proceed and then mobilize our teams and our organizations in a way to make this a reality. And this could be done in a variety of different ways. An example I have on this slide involves collaborating to encourage resiliency planning and design with a life cycle lens. And this is something that the ambassador mentioned in the example she gave as something that occurs across the country. This is another example that we have right here in Ontario with a case study in the Lower Dawnlands. And I also have an image here of an international case study that I had done in a district in Manhattan that had to deal with the aftermath of a significant hurricane in 2012 and use that as an opportunity to better encouraging resiliency planning within their municipal bylaw planning. There's also an opportunity to rethink our business practices, to address things like KPIs and how we specifically measure that overlap between climate risk and levels of services. There are a variety of different tools and techniques that are available in the market right now, but my message to you is to not only consider this technology as being the solution, but understanding how this is involved with the practices within your organization such that it offers a meaningful solution and helping to understand your asset management needs and pairing that with the climate risk challenge that is otherwise being imposed here. And finally, there's the role of partnerships. And so much of my research with private capital providers around the world looks at how we can then align the different incentives of a variety of different players to come together and recognize that sustainability, asset management, and infrastructure belong together in one sentence. How we do that in practice really requires a lot of creativity and coming back to the table to understand what our true objectives are. And there's a variety of different examples, whether in public transit, in energy, and water, whereby we're able to do that. But by and large, it does involve us stepping back and rethinking ultimately what are the objectives we want to pursue. And with that, I hope that this conference will give you a taste of the different frameworks, tools, and case studies from across Canada and even from across the world that can give you a sense of how to do this within your organization.